My name is Harper, 31 years old, an elementary school teacher from a modest family. 3 years ago, I married Jake, son of the wealthy Sterling family. My relationship with his family, especially his father Richard, has always been tense. Last Christmas dinner changed everything. Richard had no idea about the secret I'd been keeping since discovering it in my parents' attic. I never planned to reveal it, but sometimes life forces your hand. If you're watching this, drop a comment letting me know where you're from and hit that like and subscribe button as I tell you how one dinner changed my life forever. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in Connecticut, raised by two of the most hardworking people I've ever known. My dad, Tom, worked as a plumber, and my mum, Sarah, was a nurse at the local hospital. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they made sure I never went without the necessities. Their most important lesson was that honesty and hard work were more valuable than any amount of money. Those values shaped who I am today. I followed my passion for teaching and landed a job at Westfield Elementary School right after college. There's something magical about helping young minds grow. My third graders were the highlight of my days. Their innocent questions and boundless energy filled my life with purpose. I decorated my classroom with colourful educational posters and student artwork. The modest teacher's salary was enough for my simple lifestyle. The day I met Jake changed everything. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon 4 years ago. I ducked into a coffee shop to escape the downpour, and there he was. Jake Sterling sat at a corner table focused intently on his laptop. With his dark hair striking blue eyes and warm smile, he was undeniably attractive. When the shop got crowded, he offered to share his table. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, balancing my coffee and bag. "Please do," he replied with a smile that made my heart skip. We talked for hours that day. Jake was charming, intelligent, and surprisingly down to earth. He told me he worked in education policy, which immediately gave us common ground. What he didn't mention was his family background. In those early weeks of dating, I had no idea he came from one of the wealthiest families in the state. Our relationship progressed naturally. We bonded over shared interests in education, hiking, and classic films. Jake appreciated my passion for teaching and often asked about my students. I fell in love with his kindness, intelligence, and the way he listened intently when I spoke. For the first time, I felt truly seen and valued. 3 months into our relationship, Jake invited me to his family home for dinner. As we pulled up to the massive iron gates of the Sterling estate, my jaw dropped. The sprawling mansion with its manicured gardens looked like something from a movie. Panic set in as I realized I was wearing a simple sundress from a department store. "You never told me your family was wealthy," I whispered as Jake parked his car in front of the grand entrance. "I'm not wealthy. My family is," he replied with a shrug. "I wanted you to know me, not my family's money." The revelation that Jake was the son of Richard Sterling, CEO of Sterling Industries, a multinational corporation worth billions, was overwhelming. As we entered the mansion, I felt completely out of place. The marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and priceless artwork were intimidating. A housekeeper took our coats, and Jake led me to the formal living room where his parents waited. Richard Sterling was tall and imposing with silver hair and calculating eyes that seemed to assess my value immediately. His wife Diana was elegantly dressed, her smile not quite reaching her eyes as she looked me over. "So you're the teacher Jake has been talking about?" Richard said the word teacher, sounding almost like an insult from his lips. "It's lovely to meet you both," I replied, trying to hide my nervousness. "Harper graduated top of her class at Boston University," Jake added proudly. "A teaching degree," Diana remarked with a slight smile. "How quaint." Throughout that first dinner, I endured subtle jabs about my profession, my clothes, and my background. Richard questioned me about my family, my salary, and my ambitions with the intensity of a job interview. The unspoken question hung in the air: what could a simple teacher possibly want from their son, except his money? "I hope you understand, Harper, that the Sterling name comes with certain expectations," Richard said as dessert was served. "Jake has responsibilities to the family business that will shape his future." "Dad, we've talked about this," Jake interjected. "I'm committed to education reform." "A phase?" Richard dismissed with a wave of his hand. "You'll grow out of it." When Jake drove me home that night, I felt a weight on my shoulders. "I'm sorry about my parents," he said. "They'll warm up to you once they get to know you." But I wasn't sure they wanted to know me at all. In their eyes, I was just a gold digger who had somehow trapped their son. What I didn't realize then was that this first uncomfortable dinner was just the beginning of a long battle for acceptance and respect. Despite his family's obvious disapproval, Jake proposed 6 months later. We were hiking to our favorite viewpoint when he got down on one knee, presenting a simple yet elegant diamond ring that he had chosen himself rather than using a family heirloom. "I love you for who you are, Harper," Jake said, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I want to build a life with you independent of my family's expectations." When we announced our engagement, Richard and Diana's reaction was coldly polite. Behind closed doors, Jake later told me his father had exploded, calling the engagement a mistake and suggesting I was only after the sterling fortune. "She's a teacher, for God's sake," Richard had shouted. "She'll never fit into our world." Nevertheless, the Sterling family insisted on handling the wedding arrangements. What should have been our special day became a society event with over 300 guests, most of whom I had never met. Diana overruled my simple tastes at every turn, replacing my choices with extravagant alternatives that better reflected the Sterling standard. The wedding was featured in several society magazines, describing it as the social event of the season. My parents looked uncomfortable in their department store formal wear, surrounded by guests in designer outfits. My small group of friends from college and work seemed equally out of place among Jake's prep school network. Richard's speech at the reception was particularly painful. While appearing congratulatory on the surface, it was laced with backhanded compliments and veiled warnings. "Jake has always had a charitable heart," Richard said, raising his champagne glass. "His work in education shows his commitment to helping the less fortunate. Now he's brought that same spirit into his personal life." I felt my cheeks burn as the Sterling associates chuckled. Jake squeezed my hand under the table, a silent apology for his father's words. After the wedding, Jake and I chose to live in a modest 3-bedroom house, rather than accepting Richard's offer of a penthouse apartment in one of the Sterling properties. Jake was determined to make his own way, working for an education non-profit while I continued teaching. This decision further strained his relationship with his parents, who saw it as a rejection of the lifestyle they had provided. Diana called almost daily during our first months of marriage, often when Jake was out of earshot. Her concerns always masked as helpful advice. "Harper, dear, I noticed Jake looking a bit thin at Sunday dinner. Are you making sure he eats properly? Or that shirt Jake was wearing seemed a bit wrinkled. Do you need recommendations for a good housekeeper?" Each family gathering became an exercise in endurance. Richard constantly reminded Jake about the prenuptial agreement I had signed, as if expecting our marriage to fail at any moment. Diana arranged seating to separate me from Jake, placing me next to distant relatives, while positioning Amanda, Jake's ex-girlfriend from college, and the daughter of Richard's best friend near him. Amanda was everything the Sterlings wanted for Jake. She came from wealth, had the right connections, and worked at a prestigious law firm. With her perfect blonde hair and designer wardrobe, she embodied the society wife Diana had envisioned for her son. Amanda never missed an opportunity to reminisce about her history with Jake, or to highlight my outsider status. "Remember when we sailed to your family's island for spring break, Jake?" she would say, her voice carrying across the table. "Harper, have you ever been sailing? It's quite technical." I tried everything to win over Jake's family. I volunteered for their charity functions, studied topics I knew would interest Richard, and even took etiquette classes to avoid any social faux pas. But nothing seemed to change their perception of me as the gold digger who had somehow trapped their son. "Give them time," Jake would say after particularly difficult encounters. "They just need to see what I see in you." But as months turned into years, it became clear that Richard and Diana Sterling had no intention of accepting me as part of their family. In their eyes, I would always be the servant who had married the prince. The discovery that changed everything happened on a rainy Sunday afternoon, 2 years into our marriage. My parents had decided to downsize, moving from their family home to a smaller condo closer to my mother's hospital. Jake and I volunteered to help them sort through decades of accumulated belongings in their attic. "There's a box of your baby things in the corner," my mother said as we climbed the narrow stairs. "You might want to look through it before we decide what to keep." The cardboard box was worn at the edges, labelled Harper's baby items, in my mother's neat handwriting. Inside were the expected mementos, a tiny knit hat, my hospital bracelet, first shoes, and a baby book filled with milestones. At the bottom, wrapped in acid-free paper, was a manila envelope I'd never seen before. "Mum, what's this?" I called out, but she had already gone downstairs. Curious, I opened the envelope. Inside were documents that made my heart stop: adoption papers with my name on them. According to these papers, I wasn't born Sarah and Tom Wilson's daughter. I was adopted at 6 months old. My hands trembled as I read further. There was a birth certificate with different names, parents Jonathan and Elizabeth Moore. The documents indicated they had died in a car accident when I was just 5 months old. Harper, did you find everything okay? My mum's voice startled me as she appeared at the top of the stairs. She saw the papers in my hands and her face fell. Oh, honey, we were going to tell you when you turned 18, but then you were dealing with college applications, and it never seemed like the right time. Through tears, my parents explained everything. They had been friends with the Moores, who were a wealthy couple unable to have children of their own. When the Moores finally had me after years of fertility treatments, it was the happiest day of their lives. Then the accident happened. They named us as your guardians in their will, my father explained. We loved you from the moment they first placed you in our arms at the hospital. You became our daughter in every way that matters. I was too shocked to be angry about the decades of secrecy. Instead, I had questions about my birth parents, who were Jonathan and Elizabeth Moore. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. After an emotional weekend with my parents, I began researching the Moores in private. What I discovered left me breathless. Jonathan Moore had been the founder and CEO of Moore Enterprises, a technology and real estate conglomerate that had once been a major competitor to Sterling Industries. Further research revealed that after my birth parents' deaths, control of Moore Enterprises had passed to a board of trustees until I reached the age of 30. The trustees were supposed to locate me on my 30th birthday, but something had clearly gone wrong. Either they hadn't tried hard enough to find me, or someone had deliberately kept me in the dark. I contacted a lawyer specializing in inheritance law, meeting him secretly while Jake was at work. The confirmation of my suspicions was like a thunderbolt. I was the sole heir to the Moore fortune, which had grown substantially under the trustees' management. Moore Enterprises was now valued at billions, making me on paper at least as wealthy as the Sterlings. There appears to have been some irregularities in how your case was handled, the lawyer Mr. Brennan explained. The trustee in charge of locating you, Gerald Watson, seems to have filed false reports claiming you couldn't be found. Meanwhile, he's been drawing a substantial salary as interim CEO. Why wouldn't he have found me? My adoption wasn't sealed. That's what we need to investigate, Mr. Brennan replied. The good news is that with these documents and a DNA test, we can establish your identity beyond doubt. As the biological daughter of Jonathan and Elizabeth Moore, you are legally entitled to your inheritance with interest for the delayed transfer. I sat in Mr. Brennan's office, overwhelmed by the implications. I had gone from being the gold-digging teacher to the heiress of a fortune that rivaled the Sterlings' wealth. The irony was almost too much to bear. After confirming my identity through legal channels, I faced a difficult decision: should I tell Jake and his family about my discovery? Part of me wanted to see Richard's face when he learned that the woman he had treated like a servant was actually his business equal. But another part of me was afraid of how this revelation would change my relationship with Jake. Would Jake feel betrayed that I had kept such a significant secret? Would he think I was no different from his family, valuing wealth and status? Most importantly, would knowing about my inheritance change how he felt about me? After days of internal struggle, I decided to keep my discovery to myself, at least temporarily. I wanted to understand more about my birth parents and the company they had built before making any public announcements. And selfishly, perhaps I wanted to be sure of Jake's love without the complication of sudden wealth. I choose who knows about this, right? I asked Mr. Brennan during our follow-up meeting. This doesn't have to become public knowledge immediately. As your attorney, I'm bound by confidentiality, he assured me. The trustees will need to be informed, and there will eventually be regulatory filings when you assume control of the company, but we can manage the timeline to some extent. So I began living a double-life teacher and wife, by day heiress and business owner, in secret. I met with executives from Moore Enterprises, learning about the company my birth parents had built. I discovered that Elizabeth Moore had been a brilliant software engineer, and Jonathan, a visionary real estate developer. Their combined expertise had created a unique business model that integrated smart technology into commercial properties. Looking at photographs of them, I finally saw where I got my red hair and green eyes. In video clips from company events, I recognized my own laugh in Elizabeth's. These strangers were my parents, and yet I mourned their loss as if I had known them my whole life. As I learned more about Moore Enterprises, I also discovered the bitter rivalry that had existed between my birth father and Richard Sterling. The two men had competed fiercely in the real estate market, with Jonathan often outmaneuvering Richard. According to longtime employees, Richard had never forgiven Jonathan for winning a particularly valuable development contract in downtown Boston. The knowledge of this rivalry gave me pause. If Richard had treated me poorly as a simple teacher, how would he react to learning I was the daughter of his greatest business rival? As I secretly explored my new identity, tensions with the Sterling family continued to escalate. Jake and I were invited to a corporate gala celebrating Sterling Industries' 50 years in business. Despite my reservations, Jake insisted we attend. "It's important to my father," he explained, not recognizing the irony of his statement given how unimportant I was to Richard. I spent hours preparing for the event, choosing a simple but elegant black dress that cost more than I would typically spend. I wanted to look like I belonged, even though I knew Richard and Diana would find something to criticize. The ballroom of the Westmont Hotel was transformed for the occasion with sterling silver decorations and ice sculptures bearing the company logo. As we entered, Richard was holding court with a group of executives. He briefly acknowledged our arrival before turning his attention back to his associates. Later in the evening, as I stood alone at the edge of the room while Jake spoke with some college friends, Richard approached with an older man I didn't recognize. "This is my son's wife," Richard introduced me with a dismissive gesture. "She's a school teacher. Harper, this is Walter Grayson, our new partner in the Singapore development." "Lovely to meet you," I said, extending my hand. "A teacher? How commendable," Walter replied with the condescending tone I had grown accustomed to. "My wife does charity work with underprivileged children." "Teaching isn't charity," I responded before I could stop myself. "It's a profession that requires extensive education and skill." Richard's expression hardened. "Harper has very progressive ideas about education. Not everyone sees the value in traditional business, unfortunately." He steered Walter away quickly, but not before I overheard him adding, "Jake's going through a phase. He'll join the company eventually once certain influences are removed." That night was also notable for Amanda's prominent presence. Richard had seated her at our table directly across from Jake. She wore a stunning red dress and commanded attention with stories of her recent legal victory. "The partners are considering me for early advancement," she announced. "Richard has been so supportive, writing a recommendation letter to the managing partner." Diana beamed at Amanda. "You've always been focused on the right priorities, dear. We've always thought of you as part of the family." The implication was clear. Amanda belonged in their world in a way I never would. As the weeks passed, Diana became more direct in her disapproval. During a Sunday brunch, she casually mentioned that Amanda was now single again. "She broke up with that investment banker," Diana told Jake, while I sat right beside him. "She said he just wasn't the right fit. Some people realize their mistakes before it's too late." The pressure on Jake to join Sterling Industries also intensified. Richard began calling him daily with updates on company matters, sending him confidential reports, and inviting him to board meetings as an observer. "I'm just keeping you in the loop," Richard would say. "No pressure, but the COO position will need to be filled next year. The board would prefer family leadership." Jake was torn. Though he loved his work in education policy, I could see the pull of family obligation weighing on him. We began arguing more frequently, with Jake defending his parents' behavior. "They're from a different generation," he would say. "They don't mean to be harsh." Meanwhile, I learned that Sterling Industries was attempting to acquire a small tech company that was a subsidiary of Moore Enterprises. The acquisition would give Sterling access to proprietary software that would significantly increase their competitive advantage. Without revealing my connection, I arranged through Mr. Brennan to block the sale. When Richard's offer was rejected, he was furious, according to Jake. "Dad can't understand why they won't sell," Jake told me one evening. "He's offered well above market value. Maybe they value their independence," I suggested, feeling a twinge of guilt for my secret interference. Jake looked at me curiously. "That's almost exactly what the CEO told my father." "How did you know?" I shrugged, trying to appear casual. "Just a guess. Not everything is for sale." Richard, however, had a different theory. At a family dinner the following week, he stared at me intently. "I understand you've become friendly with Thomas Layton," he said abruptly. Layton was the CEO of the tech company Sterling was trying to acquire. I had met with him once, but always through intermediaries to maintain my privacy. "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied honestly. "Don't play innocent," Richard continued. "You were seen having lunch with him last month. I realized he must have had me followed. I meet many people through my volunteer work, I said, vaguely unwilling to confirm or deny. I hope you understand, Harper, that corporate espionage is a serious offence, Richard said, his voice dangerously quiet. Using personal relationships to interfere with business matters could have serious consequences. Jake looked between us confused. Dad, what are you talking about? Harper doesn't know anything about your business dealings. Perhaps you should ask your wife about her sudden interest in technology acquisitions, Richard suggested. The accusation hung in the air, creating yet another wedge between Jake and me. Though he didn't say it directly, I could tell Jake was beginning to wonder if there was something I wasn't telling him. The only member of the Sterling family who showed me any kindness was Jake's younger sister, Sophie. At 25, she had recently returned from graduate school in Europe and seemed unaffected by her parents' prejudices. Ignore my father, she told me during a rare moment alone. He treats everyone this way. It took my last boyfriend 2 years to get a civil word out of him, and the poor guy was a Vanderbilt. Sophie became my unexpected ally, often running interference at family gatherings and making sure I wasn't completely isolated. Her friendship made the increasingly tense situations bearable, especially as Christmas approached and Diana announced her plans for an elaborate family dinner. We'll have the usual guests, she informed us during a phone call. The Whitmores, the Prestons, and of course Amanda and her parents. Jake makes sure Harper understands the dress code this year. The photographer from Social Scene will be there. As I hung up the phone, I had no idea that this Christmas dinner would be the breaking point in my relationship with the Sterlings, forcing secrets into the open that would change everything forever. The Sterling mansion was transformed for Christmas, with professional decorators having created a magazine-worthy winter wonderland. A 20-foot Norwegian spruce dominated the grand foyer, adorned with antique ornaments and twinkling lights. Garlands of evergreen and holly draped across mantels and banisters, their scent mingling with cinnamon and cloves from the kitchen. I had spent weeks agonizing over gifts for the Sterlings, knowing that whatever I chose would be scrutinized and likely found wanting. For Richard, I selected a rare first edition of his favorite author's work, found after hours of searching specialty bookshops. For Diana, I commissioned a custom silk scarf from an artist whose work she had once admired. The gifts cost more than I could comfortably afford on my teacher's salary, but I hoped they might finally make an impression. Jake and I arrived early on Christmas Eve, as requested by Diana, who wanted family photos before the guests arrived. I wore a dark green velvet dress I had splurged on, hoping it would meet with Diana's approval. "You look beautiful," Jake whispered as we walked up the steps to the front door. "Thank you for doing this. I know these gatherings aren't easy." If only he knew how difficult they truly were. With each passing day, the weight of my secret grew heavier. More Enterprises was now formally under my control, though I continued to work through intermediaries. The trustees had been replaced with Gerald Watson, facing legal consequences for his mismanagement. The company was thriving, and soon I would need to make decisions about its future that couldn't remain hidden. Diana greeted us at the door, her critical eye sweeping over my appearance. "The dress is appropriate, but your jewelry is too minimalist for the occasion. Sophie can lend you something suitable." Before I could respond, she turned to direct a staff member about champagne service. I bit my tongue, reminding myself that this was just one evening. Jake squeezed my hand supportively as we moved into the living room, where Richard was talking with Sophie. The evening proceeded relatively smoothly until Amanda arrived with her parents. She wore a stunning red dress that undoubtedly cost thousands, her blonde hair styled in elegant waves. Diana immediately pulled her into the family photos, positioning her next to Jake, while relegating me to the edge of the frame. "For symmetry," Diana explained when I raised an eyebrow. During cocktails, Amanda monopolized Jake's attention with stories about mutual friends and shared memories. I found myself standing alone by the fireplace until Sophie joined me. "Amanda's been insufferable since she heard you and Jake were having problems," Sophie confided. "Mum's been feeding her information." "Jake and I aren't having problems," I protested. Sophie gave me a knowing look. "You've been distant with each other for weeks. Everyone's noticed." She wasn't wrong. The strain of my secret had created a wall between us. Jake sensed I was hiding something but couldn't understand what or why. Our conversations had become superficial, focused on daily logistics rather than our feelings or dreams. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, the table set with the Sterling family china and silver that predated the Revolutionary War. I sat stiffly in my assigned seat directly across from Amanda and far from Jake, who was positioned at his father's right hand. The conversation flowed around topics designed to exclude me, Boarding school memories, country club gossip, and business dealings I wasn't supposed to understand. Whenever I attempted to contribute, Diana would swiftly change the subject, or Richard would talk over me. By the time the main course arrived, Richard had consumed several glasses of his expensive scotch. His voice grew louder, his opinions more forceful, and his thinly veiled insults more direct. "Jake tells me your school is implementing a new curriculum," Richard said, suddenly addressing me directly for the first time that evening. "I suppose that keeps you busy when you're not spending Jake's money." A hush fell over the table. Even Diana looked uncomfortable with his bluntness. "I don't spend Jake's money," I replied evenly. "I earn my own salary." Richard laughed dismissively. "A teacher's pittance. Let's not pretend that pays for that dress or the lifestyle you've grown accustomed to." "Dad," Jake interjected, "that's enough." "No, let's be honest for once," Richard continued, emboldened by alcohol and years of harbored resentment. "Everyone in this room knows why she married you. A nobody teacher suddenly has access to the sterling fortune. It's the oldest story in the book." Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. 3 years of enduring his contempt had built my resistance. "I married Jake because I love him," I said quietly. "Something you seem incapable of understanding." "Love," Richard scoffed. "How convenient that you found love with one of the wealthiest heirs in New England." "Oh, Richard?" "Perhaps this isn't the time," Diana murmured, glancing anxiously at their guests. "When is the time, Diana? When she's taken half of everything Jake has? When she's influenced him to waste his potential on feel-good education projects instead of taking his rightful place in the company?" Jake stood abruptly. "That's my choice, Dad, not Harper's." "Is it?" Richard challenged. "You were on track to join the executive team before she came along. Now you're throwing away generations of legacy for a woman who contributes nothing to this family." The dining room fell silent as Richard delivered his final blow. "Let's be clear about your position here," he said, pointing his fork at me. "You're just a servant in this house. You serve a purpose for my son that will eventually end when he comes to his senses. You will never be a Sterling." The words hung in the air like poison. I saw Jake's shock, Sophie's outrage, and worst of all, Amanda's satisfied smile. Something inside me broke. 3 years of enduring their contempt, of trying to prove my worth, of keeping my secret, all came crashing down in that moment. My hands shook as I reached for my purse hanging on the back of my chair. The documents I had been carrying for weeks, uncertain whether I would ever reveal them, suddenly felt like a shield against Richard's cruelty. "Actually, Richard," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "I think it's time we clarified exactly who is serving whom." The room grew completely still as I pulled out a leather portfolio from my purse. Jake stared at me with confusion, while Richard's expression wavered between anger and curiosity. "Harper, what are you doing?" Jake asked quietly. I took a deep breath, knowing there was no going back once I spoke the words. "I'm establishing the truth once and for all." I opened the portfolio and removed several official-looking documents, placing them on the table. "My name is Harper Wilson Sterling, born Harper Elizabeth Moore. I am the daughter of Jonathan and Elizabeth Moore, founders of Moore Enterprises." Richard's face drained of colour as the name registered. Diana gasped audibly, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. "That's impossible," Richard stammered. "The Moores died decades ago in a car accident. Their child was lost in the system." I finished for him. "Not lost. Adopted by a loving couple who raised me without any knowledge of my birth parents or my inheritance." Jake reached for the documents, scanning them with increasing astonishment. "Harper, how long have you known this?" 6 months, I admitted. "I found the adoption papers when helping my parents move. Everything else came after through legal investigations." Richard shook his head dismissively. "This is preposterous. Anyone can forge documents." "These aren't forgeries," I replied calmly. "They've been authenticated by the court. DNA testing has confirmed my identity beyond any doubt. I am the sole heir to the Moore fortune and controlling shareholder of Moore Enterprises." The words hung in the air like thunderclaps. Amanda's smug expression had vanished, replaced by open-mouthed shock. Diana looked like she might faint. "If you need further proof," I continued, removing another document, "here's confirmation of the recent restructuring of the Moore Enterprises Board of Directors. You might notice that Gerald Watson, the trustee, who conveniently couldn't find me for years, has been removed pending criminal charges for breach of fiduciary duty." Richard grabbed the paper, his hands trembling slightly as he read. "This is dated last month." "Yes," I confirmed. I've officially been in control of More Enterprises for 3 weeks now. The implications were sinking in for everyone at the table. More Enterprises was a major competitor to Sterling Industries, with comparable valuation and market share. In an instant, I had gone from gold-digging teacher to business rival. "There's more," I said, unable to resist the opportunity to watch Richard squirm. "You might be interested to know that More Enterprises has recently acquired Northern Star Technology. I believe Sterling Industries was also bidding for that company." Richard's face flushed with anger. "That was you. You blocked our acquisition." "Not personally," I clarified. "I simply instructed my team to make a more attractive offer. Business, nothing personal. I'm sure you understand." Diana made a strangled sound and reached for her water glass, spilling it in the process. A server rushed forward to clean up the mess as Diana excused herself from the table, visibly shaken. "You've been lying to us to Jake this entire time," Richard accused, finding his voice again. "That's rich coming from you," Sophie interjected unexpectedly. "You've treated Harper like dirt for years based on lies and assumptions." Jake remained silent, his expression unreadable, as he processed the revelation. His silence hurt more than Richard's anger. Amanda suddenly stood up, gathering her purse. "I should go. This seems like a family matter." "Stay right where you are," Sophie commanded with surprising authority. "You've been circling my brother like a vulture, hoping his marriage would fail. You should hear this too." Amanda reluctantly sat back down, looking uncomfortable for the first time that evening. "I didn't plan to tell any of you like this," I admitted, looking directly at Jake. "I wanted time to understand what this inheritance meant for me, for us. I was raised by Tom and Sarah Wilson. They're my parents in every way that matters. The Moores are strangers to me, despite our biological connection." "And the money?" Richard asked bitterly. "Is that a stranger to you too?" "The money changes nothing about who I am," I replied firmly. "I'm still a teacher. I still care about education. The only difference is that now I have the resources to make a bigger impact." I turned to Jake, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I was afraid it would change things between us. I never wanted wealth or status. I just wanted you." Jake finally met my eyes, his expression softening slightly. "We need to talk. Privately." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "This is absurd. You expect us to believe you've been living as a teacher when you could have been living as an heiress. Nobody makes that choice." "I didn't make that choice," I corrected him. "The choice was made for me when information about my birth parents was withheld. But once I learned the truth, yes, I chose not to let it define me. Unlike you, Richard, I don't believe a person's worth is determined by their bank account." I stood up, suddenly exhausted by the confrontation. "Jake, I'll wait for you in the car. I think I've ruined Christmas dinner enough for one night." As I walked toward the door, I heard Richard call after me, his voice laced with disbelief and the first notes of something that sounded almost like respect. "Harper," I paused and turned. "The Moore building in downtown Boston. Jonathan outbid me for that property 30 years ago. It was personal for him, wasn't it?" I nodded. "According to the company records, yes. He knew you had tried to force his father out of business years earlier. The building was his way of showing the Moores couldn't be bullied." A strange expression crossed Richard's face. "You're more like him than you realize." It wasn't exactly a compliment, but coming from Richard Sterling, it was the closest thing to acceptance I had ever received. The week following Christmas was the most emotionally exhausting of my life. Jake and I spent hours talking through everything. The initial shock and hurt in his eyes when he realized I had kept such a significant secret was painful to witness. "I thought we told each other everything," he said, as we sat in our living room the night after the disastrous dinner. "Finding out like that in front of everyone, it felt like I didn't know who you were." "I'm the same person I've always been," I insisted, tears streaming down my face. "That's why I didn't tell you right away. I needed time to process it myself. Can you imagine what it was like? My entire identity changed overnight." Gradually, as I shared the full story, Jake's anger gave way to understanding. I showed him photographs of my birth parents that I'd collected, pointed out the resemblances, and explained the complicated legal process of reclaiming my inheritance. "I get why you kept it to yourself," Jake finally admitted 3 days after Christmas. "If our situations were reversed, I might have done the same thing, but no more secrets, Harper. We're partners. Whatever comes next, we face it together." His forgiveness was like oxygen after nearly drowning. We held each other that night, rebuilding the trust that had been damaged but not destroyed. The situation with Richard was far more complicated. A week after the Christmas dinner revelation, he requested a meeting at his office. Jake offered to come with me, but I decided to face Richard alone. The Sterling Industries headquarters occupied a gleaming skyscraper in downtown Boston, not far from the Moore building that had been mentioned at dinner. Richard's corner office offered sweeping views of the harbour, with model ships displayed in glass cases representing the maritime origins of the Sterling fortune. "Thank you for coming," Richard said formally as I was shown in by his assistant. No handshake, no warmth, but at least the open hostility had been replaced by cautious neutrality. "Your revelation at Christmas was unexpected," he continued, gesturing for me to take a seat. "I've had my team verify your claims. It appears congratulations are in order." "This isn't a competition, Richard," I replied, settling into the chair across from his massive desk. "Everything is a competition," he countered. "Surely Jonathan's daughter understands that," I sighed. "Is that why you wanted to see me? To establish that we're business rivals now?" Richard leaned back in his chair, studying me with new eyes. "Partially. I need to understand your intentions regarding Sterling Industries. Our companies have overlapping interests in several markets." "I have no desire to create conflict between our companies," I assured him. "What happens in the boardroom can stay in the boardroom. It doesn't have to affect our family relationship." "Family relationship," Richard repeated slowly, as if testing the concept. "That's a generous assessment after how we've treated you." It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get from Richard Sterling. I decided to accept it for what it was. "People make judgments based on the information they have," I said carefully. "You assumed I married Jake for his money because that fit your understanding of the world. I'm not saying it didn't hurt, but I understand why you thought that way." Richard nodded slightly, acknowledging the point without admitting fault, typical of a man accustomed to never showing weakness. "Jake loves you," he said abruptly. "That much has been clear from the beginning. I thought it was infatuation that he was captivated by someone so different from our world. I expected it to fade. And now I recognize that I underestimated you both." He straightened some papers on his desk, uncomfortable with emotional directness. "Diana and I would like to invite you and Jake to dinner next week. Just family, no guests. Perhaps we can establish a new foundation." It wasn't quite acceptance, not yet, but it was a beginning. As I left Richard's office, I felt a weight lifting. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but it was clearer than before. In the months that followed, I made several significant decisions. First, I established the Moore Foundation, dedicated to educational access for underprivileged children. A substantial portion of my inheritance went into creating scholarships, building schools, and supporting teacher training programs. Second, I chose to continue teaching, reducing to part-time, so I could also fulfill my responsibilities to more enterprises. My students remained the highlight of my days, keeping me grounded as I navigated my new reality. Third, and perhaps most surprising to the outside world, Moore Enterprises and Sterling Industries announced a strategic partnership on a major development project. Richard and I appeared together at the press conference, presenting a united front that sent business reporters into a frenzy of speculation. Jake found his own path forward as well. Released from the burden of family expectations, he created an education policy think tank that would influence legislation at the state and national levels. Richard, to everyone's surprise, became one of his earliest supporters. My relationship with Diana improved more slowly than with Richard. Her pride had been deeply wounded by the revelation, and she struggled to relinquish her vision of the perfect Sterling daughter-in-law. However, when I asked for her help with the first Moore Foundation fundraising gala, something shifted between us. "You're asking for my input," she said, surprised by the invitation to review the event plans. "You organize the best charity events in Boston," I replied honestly. "I'd be foolish not to learn from your expertise." It was the right approach. Diana thrived on being needed for her social skills, and helping with the foundation gave her a way to connect with me that felt comfortable for both of us. Sophie, of course, was delighted by the entire situation. "The look on Amanda's face when you dropped that bomb at Christmas," she reminded me gleefully during lunch one day. "I've never seen someone turn that particular shade of green." Amanda herself had made herself scarce since the Christmas revelation, suddenly too busy with work commitments to attend Sterling family functions. When our paths occasionally crossed at social events, she was politely distant, her earlier condescension replaced by careful neutrality. The greatest joy came 6 months after the Christmas dinner when Jake and I discovered we were expecting our first child. The news brought Diana and Richard to our house, with champagne sparkling cider for me and incredibly tears in Diana's eyes. "A grandchild," she whispered, hugging me spontaneously for the first time. "Our family's future." That night, as Jake and I sat on our porch swing, his hand resting protectively on my still flat stomach, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. "What would you have done if my parents had accepted you from the beginning?" Jake asked, stroking my hair. "Would you have told me about your inheritance sooner?" "I don't know," I admitted. The irony is that Richard's behaviour forced me to reveal the truth. If he hadn't called me a servant at Christmas dinner, I might have kept my secret much longer. Jake chuckled. "So in a weird way, we have my father's terrible behaviour to thank for bringing everything into the open." "Life is strange that way," I agreed, leaning against his shoulder. "The things that hurt us most can sometimes lead to unexpected healing." The sun was setting, casting golden light across our modest front yard. Soon, we would need to consider a larger home for our growing family. But for now, this house that represented our independence felt exactly right. I thought about the baby growing inside me, a child who would inherit legacies from both the Sterlings and the Moores, but hopefully none of the bitterness that had divided the families for generations. This child would grow up knowing their value came from within, not from bank accounts or social status. Looking back on that Christmas dinner that changed everything, I realized that Richard's cruel words calling me just a servant had actually been my liberation. In trying to put me in my place, he had inadvertently set me free to claim my true identity and power. The greatest lesson I learnt through this journey was that true worth isn't determined by what others think of you or by the size of your bank account. It's found in knowing who you are and standing firmly in that truth even when the world tries to tell you otherwise. Have you ever had a moment when someone's attempt to hurt you backfired completely? Or have you kept a secret that eventually had to come out? Share your story in the comments below. If this video resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more stories of unexpected transformations. Thank you for listening to my journey from servant to equal, and remember that sometimes the labels others give us are the very ones we need to shed to discover our true strength.